Well, good morning, everyone. Hopefully everyone can see and hear me okay. Um, welcome to our webinar today on benefits of native grasses. And we've got some great presenters today, some great information. We are gonna try to get you to all of them, get through all of their content and stay on schedule today. And so I appreciate you jumping on here. Hopefully you've got something warm brewing for lunch because it is cold outside here for sure. We've got three presenters today that we're going to go through, and I'm actually going to go ahead and send it to our first one now, so he can go ahead and get his presentation queued up while I'm talking. And from there, if you have any questions, you should see over on the right-hand side there is a questions tab. If you can kind of type any of those in there, we'll probably hold those until everyone's done. All three of our presenters are done, and then we'll kind of do a Q&A session at the end. So you can hold your questions till closer to then, or if you can go ahead and submit them early, I will kind of get those queued up and be ready to ask those to the presenters today. So our first presenter is Landry Jones, Conservation Grazing Specialist with MFA Incorporated. Landry was born and raised in Southwest Missouri, began his career with the Missouri Department of Conservation in Central Missouri, managing public lands, and then got the opportunity to move back to Southwest Missouri in 2013 to work as a private lands conservationist for the Missouri Department of Conservation. In December of 2019, he began employment with MFA Incorporated in a partnership position with MDC, NRCS, Missouri DNR as our conservation grazing specialist. He works with livestock producers in the state to help show not only environmental but also financial benefits of utilizing conservation grazing management in their operations. And he currently resides in Aldrich, Missouri with a wife, 2 daughters, and he operates a small cow-calf herd down there. So Landry, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Adam. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I think this is a good topic, especially as we come on to spring. I know the last few days hasn't really seemed like spring would ever get here, but it looks like the next week temperature's supposed to turn around, and so talking about warm season forages, I think can be pretty vital for producers. So kind of just a brief overview. Kind of my presentation today, we'll talk about why native warm season grasses, why one would even kind of maybe think of or consider installing these forages and the benefits that these forages provide, as well as a little bit of the establishment and management on these forages as they get established and as you kind of incorporate them into your operation. So, historically, native warm season grasses occurred throughout most of Missouri, and you can see here on this kind of pre-European settlement map that the essentially western half of Missouri would have been historically native prairie. And so this is just to kind of illustrate that these forages, these plants are adapted to our soils, they're adapted to our climate, and God put them here for a reason. And so they fit real well currently in today's world, back into those systems. There's some soil health benefits, and a couple of the other presenters today will talk on the soil health benefits as well as wildlife benefits. But this graphic here is just to illustrate the amount of not only above ground growth that these warm season grasses can provide, but also the below ground growth and the root mass that they have. And we know that the symbiotic relationship between the microorganisms and the fungi that are in the soil is a direct correlation to the root mass that's below ground. And so there is some great soil health benefits that these native warm season grasses provide, and I'll let Mr. Drexel Atkinson kind of expand on that more in his presentation. But they also provide some good wildlife benefits, specifically for our ground nesting birds. These grasses grow in kind of a bunch forming growth habit, and so they provide bare ground for our ground nesting birds, which a lot of our cool season grasses, particularly fescue, don't really provide that. And so from a wildlife benefit, these grasses can be very beneficial. One of the other things I think that that needs to be mentioned on why native warm season grasses can be beneficial to a livestock operation is they're very drought tolerant. Like I mentioned, they're historically were found here in Missouri, and so they're adapted to our soils and our climate. And this graphic just kind of illustrates that, you know, I went back here, and this is starting in 2006 in that upper left. But essentially, you know, 6 of the last 10 to 15 years, there's been some sort of a D2 or most times D3 droughts located somewhere in Missouri. And this year was no different. This is October 2020, and you can see that red bullseye over southwest Missouri, you know, right where I'm located, we came into a D3 drought. And so this is just to kind of illustrate that it's not really a matter of if a drought's going to happen. It's just a matter of when a drought's going to happen. And these native warm season grasses do very good in those kind of droughty conditions. And they're really good and cheap insurance if you think about it. This is 2018, a producer, and I'll go more into depth in this scenario or this particular situation later on my presentation. But this picture was taken in 2018, and if everybody probably remembers, in 2018 we had some pretty bad drought in northern Missouri as well as in southwest Missouri. Most of the state was seeing some sort of a drought, but that's really when these grasses, these native warm season grasses, shine, so to speak, is in those drought conditions. And so, you know, in 2018 and 2012, we had a lot of producers that were either buying really high-priced hay to get them through the summer, or they were destocking their operation. You know, there was a lot of probably operations that went out of business because they didn't have the forage available in those summer months, and that's what these native warm season grasses really provide. So, you know, the difference, you know, you might ask, well, what's the difference between a warm season grass and a cool season grass? And really, it's their kind of growth pattern. And so for our cool season grasses, usually in mid-May, the growth starts to decline. The plants really stop supporting much growth, and so the nutrient level also starts to decline. We decline in quantity as well as quality in those cool season forages. And really, that's when our warm season grasses just really get going. You all may have seen this before, but this is just kind of what folks call the summer slump, and you can see that you know, this cool season grass growth curve peaks, you know, in mid-May or excuse me, late April, early May, and then really starts to decline in the summer months, and then picks back up in the fall. And so producers that don't have some sort of a warm season forage on their operation are really dependent on what that summer is going to provide their operation and those animals. And so these warm season grasses really just kind of fill that summer slump or that void that most producers, most operations are seeing in those summer months. Some benefits that we can see to cattle, you know, we can talk about the benefits to soil health, and we can talk about the benefits to wildlife that these forages provide. But when it comes down to brass tacks, it needs to be beneficial to the cattle, and it needs to be beneficial to the producer in the form of increased profits. And so these native warm season grasses really can improve weaning weights on spring calves. So if you're a spring calving operation, just by grazing pairs on these forages in the summer months, we can see increased weaning weights come fall time, you know, anywhere from 50 to 100 pounds increased weight gain on them animals. These forages, in my eye, really shine when it comes to backgrounding fall calves, or you know, if you're a fall calving operation, or if you're a stocker operation that are purchasing calves to grow out. You know, there's a reason that the Flint Hills of Kansas have been doing this for eons, and that's because these native warm season grasses, these prairie grasses, can really put the pounds on these calves. You know, probably looking at on average probably 2 pounds of gain throughout the summer months. And it just provides more grazing days in general. So we've got that more forage, the increased forage availability to those animals, which in turn increases grazing days, which in turn can increase carrying capacity. And then also improved conception. We know that, you know, on our fescue, because of the toxicity, we can have some issues when it comes to breeding. And so that's one reason that, you know, our spring, quote unquote, spring calving season here in Missouri is January, February, March, because we got to have those bulls out there before our summer gets too hot. And in a sense, that fescue becomes too toxic and decrease conception rates. I'm going to run through kind of a scenario here. What I typically tell most folks if they're interested in native warm season grasses, to try to institute some rotational grazing. These forages will really show themselves if we can manage them properly. And it takes a little bit of a mind shift to manage these. They're not managed like our cool season grasses. But with that, this scenario is a producer in Dade County, Missouri, and essentially he had about 80 acres of grazable acres on this farm of his, and this was continuously grazed. He used some cost share to come in and decide that he wanted to rotationally graze this farm, and so he started putting in some fences to subdivide these pastures into different paddocks. With this rotational grazing system, usually the most limiting factor is water, and with this cost share was able to install some watering sources through these paddocks to better utilize that forage growth, and then also decided to put in some warm season grass, native warm season grass while he was at it. And so this producer essentially converted about 32 acres of warm season grass through a couple years time to put in about a third or a little more of his farm into warm season grasses. And that's kind of the depending on the operation and how they're using their forage, that 25 to 30%, 20 to 30% of your farm in a native warm season grass is kind of the recommended rate. Now, this gentleman does hay some of that, and so that would be an option to maybe increase those acres if you're not just using them for grain, but also for haying purposes. And so, does it pay? We're going to have a lot of expense even with cost share, there's going to be some expense of fencing and watering. And so does it really pay? And so most farms, if they don't have some warm season forages on their operation that they're utilizing, they probably need to be stocking their farm if they're properly stocked for what that farm's going to produce in July and August, those slow months of that cool season forage. Well, if you're stocking if you establish native warm season grasses, then you really no longer have to stock that farm for what your summer months can provide, because you've got a perennial forage that's growing, and so now you can typically, if you weren't overstocked to begin with, can increase animals on that farm. And in this scenario, this gentleman went from about 15 pairs on continuously grazing that 80 acres or so to just by instituting rotational grazing, bump that up to 25 pairs, and then with the native warm season grasses was able to increase that to 30 animals. And so you can see just by doing some proper kind of conservation grazing management, he was able to essentially double his herd on that farm. So we can kind of get into some more nuts and bolts of the economics of these native warm season grasses, and this is just kind of some generic scenarios, but from a spring calving operation, it's going to give you an extra 90 days of grazing, and then on the low side, probably if you're getting an extra 50 pounds on those weaned calves, depending on what those prices are, in this scenario with those 30 head, you're looking at a couple $1,000s more income per year. If you're using that farm for a stocker operation or your fall calving operation, and you're utilizing that farm, then those 30 head of stockers can gain on average a couple pounds a day for those 90 days, and you can see the increased profits on that as well. And so just for this farm example, that 80 acres added from the warm season grass side of things added 5 cows to his herd, which in a sense, from a gross income standpoint, it was an extra $3,000 to $4,000. So you can see how the cost of setting up rotational grazing and installing native warm season grasses can be costly on the front end, but will pay dividends in the years to come. So here's another point that folks maybe either don't want to admit or aren't really thinking about. But here in Southwest Missouri, our spring calving season is, like I mentioned, is January, February, and March, quote unquote spring. And if you're not a row crop operation, and I completely understand that if you are a row crop operation, those are the months that you really have some downtime or not as busy with your row crop operation, and that just lends itself well to be calving. But here in Southwest Missouri, where we don't have a lot of row crops, that's our calving season. And mainly for the sheer fact that we're grazing fescue, and like I mentioned, we've got to have those bulls in at a certain time period so that they can get their job done. Well, by having that early calving season, that essentially means that we're weaning calves and selling calves in September, October, and November, when our calf market is typically the lowest. And so by having these warm season forages and having those animals off of that toxic fescue, we're able to push back that calving season, which would be very beneficial this year, to get them out of the cold winter months, and in a sense also pick up some of the upswing of the market later on in the year or after the first of the year. So from a management side of things, it is different than grazing cool season grasses. We can't graze them as tight or as short, and we want to try to keep them as vegetated as possible. So in a rotational graze system that sets itself up well to really start grazing when it gets about thigh high, what I tell most folks is turn them in about thigh high and pull them out about boot high. And so what that does is really just kind of keeps that grass vegetative. They're consuming the most nutritious part of that plant, and is the most beneficial to those animals. The last thing to kind of remember from a grazing management side of things is removing those animals prior to frost, about 30 to 45 days, and that just allows this grass to put its nutrients and root reserves back down into those roots so that stand can persist for the years to come. When it comes to managing the canopy, we can see here that just by allowing those animals to graze, there's really no reason to graze any shorter than that, 12 to 15 inches, because they're not going to gain anymore. So if we can keep it vegetative, we can see increased weight gains. From a haying side of things, this grass can be very beneficial. This is this scenario. This is a gentleman in Polk County that I worked with. And this scenario, he converted some acres back in 2016 to Big Blue Indian and Little Blue Stem. This picture was taken in 2018 on August 3rd, after he had taken his first cutting of hay that second week of June. And you can see on the right side of that photo is a fescue hayfield. On the left side is a warm season grass hayfield. And those fields were cut the exact same day, the second week of June, and you can see hardly any regrowth to that fescue, where that warm season grass, he's getting ready to cut it again. And that hay tested about 8% protein. The fescue on the right side of that picture yielded less than 1 ton per acre on his first cutting, and he essentially got no second cutting. He was able to come in, we got some rains late in the fall, he was able to get a small second cutting, but it essentially amounted to not much. The first cutting of his native warm season grass yielded 2.9 tons per acre on his first cutting, and the second cutting, which was at August 2nd, yielded 1.9 tons. So in 2018 in Southwest Missouri, I can guarantee you, from a cool season grass standpoint, there was nobody that was yielding, almost 4 tons to the acre of forage. Here's another picture just to illustrate that. This is another warm season grass field that he had, native warm season grass. This field was cut July 25th, and essentially no rain between that cutting and this picture of August 3rd, and very few days below 90 degrees. And you can see the regrowth of that field. And so that just kind of illustrates the ability for these forages to really persist in drought conditions. And that's really all I have. I wanted to mention this. It's hard for myself and the other two presenters to really go into much detail on the benefits of these native warm season grasses from a livestock production standpoint, but there is a in-person workshop that's going to be held in Mount Vernon, Missouri at the MU Southwest Research Center on March 25th from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. And myself and a couple of the other presenters here, one of the other presenters, will be talking in more detail. So if you're interested in how to establish them, how to manage them, some cost share programs, things like that, please feel free to call that number 417-357-6812 to register, or you can register online by that link there. But that is an MU extension program, but we've got some partners that are involved with it as well. And with that, I'll hold all my questions until the end. I appreciate it. Adam, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Landry. Appreciate it. Appreciate it very much. It was a good presentation, and like you said, it's hard to cover everything here as quickly as we can. I am getting everybody's questions that are coming in, so keep sending those, and I'll hold those till the end, and hopefully we'll get through everything. While I introduce our next speaker here, I have went ahead and passed it over to him, so hopefully he can get his presentation queued up. Next up will be Drexel Atkinson. He's an area soil health specialist with USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. Drexel spent his early years growing up on a beef farm in southwest Missouri. Being raised in the cow-calf business provided a strong foundation in agriculture. After receiving a degree in agronomy from what is now Missouri State University, he started a career in conservation with the NRCS. Continuing the tradition, he and his wife have raised 5 children on the farm. The cattle operation has continued to grow and provided an excellent opportunity to put into practice many of the conservation concepts encouraged by NRCS. A 30-year career with NRCS has been very rewarding, and helping people make good conservation decisions for their own farms is dear to his heart. As a soil health specialist, much of his time is spent educating others about soil health and helping them to adopt sound conservation practices that address the soil health principles. Drexel has a deep passion for soil health, sustainability, and the regeneration of our working lands. Very eager to help anyone with a conservation mind, and believes soil health improvement is the path to preserving the way life he grew up in. And he's going to talk today about understanding the differences between cool season grass and warm season grass. And Drexel, take it away.
All right, thank you, Adam. Yes, I want to visit with you today about the differences between cool season and warm season, but particularly the soil health benefits of warm season grass. I'm assuming that they can see this, Adam. Just a quick check.
Yep, absolutely. You're good, Drexel. I can see
Okay.
your presentation and I can hear you.
Okay, great. So you saw this slide before from Landry, and just want to point out that as you can see, the differences between the root structures of the warm season grasses and the cool season grass. The cool season grass on your left and the warm season on the right. But you notice the yellow strands that are associated with the roots of the warm season grass. Those are actually fungi hyphae. So the mycorrhizal fungi that they associate with extends their root system multiple times. This increases their ability to get nutrients and water, and we'll talk more about their efficiencies. But this association is extremely important for their resilience to the things that Landry had talked about in the climate, and then you saw his slide about the droughts. The association here with these fungi make them much more resilient and efficient with water. So just a quick look at these cool season grasses that we're all fairly familiar with, and I've put up there that there's a 3-carbon chain. That's when we say C3 or cool season. They have 3 carbons in their molecular makeup. Fescue, orchard grass, bluegrass, rye grass are just some examples of those that we're all pretty familiar with. They grow when the nights are above 50 degrees, but the days are below 80 degrees, and they're not as efficient with inputs. And when you think about the design of these grasses, especially with water, when you saw, and we'll see it again here later, but the growth curves that Landry had shown with the biggest growth curve in the spring when water is traditionally very abundant. They were not designed to be efficient with water. They didn't need to be. In fact, they need to be getting rid of that water. Fertilizer and sunshine. And so sunshine is the one we're going to focus on just a little bit, but fertilizer, when we think about the fertility needs of cool season grasses versus warm season grasses, the fertility needs are 2 to 3 times higher for cool season grasses than they are warm season grasses. And when they don't form those biological relationships, they depend on our inputs much more than the warm season grass. but sunshine is the one I want to focus on as we look to the warm season grasses. Cool season grasses, they do not convert sunshine into sugar nearly as efficient as the warm season grasses. So they're not as friendly to the soil biology. And I picked on fescue just a little bit here where I say it's downright rude. One of the protection designs of fescue is to be a little rude to the biology. That keeps competition at bay. Fescue has a lot less association than other cool season grasses as a defense mechanism. So we look at this slide again, and I've put it in here a couple times because I really want this impression to stick in your mind with the association that warm season grasses have with the biology. And the more that the biology provides to the grass, the less that we have to provide. Warm season grass, C4 plants, they have 4 carbons in their molecular makeup. And some of the more common ones, the big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, little blue stem, eastern gamma grass, I didn't put on here, but it's a common native. And I just want to point out, we don't have them listed here, but there are many annual warm season grasses such as sedan and millets and things like that that are annuals, and there are some introduced warm season grasses that have run their course. Say run their course. We've diddled with those. They don't have the ability to. They're not adapted to our climate like the natives. So the natives definitely have proven to withstand the test of time, just like Landry had put in his presentation. Warm season grasses grow when the nights are above 60. So as he said, mid-May, they start to grow at 60-degree nights and days above 70. So you notice a big difference. Daytime above 70, and the cool season grasses were growing when the daytime temps were below 80. So they start to really want to kick out those cool seasons when it gets warm, and the warm season grasses really want to kick in. They're very efficient with inputs. They'll produce more pounds of feed with 1/3 of the fertilizer or no fertilizer, and this is because of that biological association. But I also want to bring back this sunshine. So the whole process of making plant material, the plant needs to gather sunshine, convert that to energy, from solar energy to plant energy, and make enough of it that it has all that it needs, and then share with the biological portion of our soil. Cool season grasses struggle with this, and the warm season grasses do a great job. So that process is making sugar, taking and combining carbon with water and making simple glucose. And again, making enough for itself, and then leaking, which you'll hear a lot of times, root exudes. And those root exudes are the C6H12O6, or simple glucose of carbon and water leaked into the soil to feed that biology. Will continue to produce in times of low moisture. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. So warm season grasses are friendly to the soil biology. This relationship is why they are efficient. We have an opportunity to collect, when we look at the growing portion or season for warm season grasses, beginning mid-May and ending around the 1st of October in Southwest Missouri, because we start to get cool. We may not have frosted and gone into dormancy yet, but we're beginning to slow down. But that time between mid-May and 1st of October, these grasses have the ability to put a massive amount of that solar energy into our soils, and that is key to the restoration and the building of carbon or soil organic matter back into our soils. And I just want to bring up that, you know, as Landry pointed out, the last several years we've had to mitigate, and I've heard this presented, and I think it's worth mentioning again, that the mitigation, and I'll expand on that just for a minute when we talk about mitigation, but our weather events, a farm that has some built-in sustainability, some built-in resilience with the grazing system and incorporating warm season grasses into that system, will mitigate 5 years out of 10 less times than a farm without resiliency built in. Out of any given 10 years, weather is going to provide you an opportunity to have to mitigate. So we're going to have to mitigate 5 years more if we don't build in some sustainability. And mitigation means you're going to write a check. That is what you do as a producer to mitigate either too dry, too hot, too wet, too cold, anything that the weather throws at us, we mitigate by writing a check. So we look at these warm season grasses to help with sustainability, incorporating more carbon into the soils, and giving us resiliency against this. And this is really it in a nutshell. When we look at approximately 2/3 of your organic matter increase will come from roots. When we have much more root mass with the warm season grasses than we do with the cool season grasses. And this goes back to what I mentioned about cool season grasses. They don't need to have roots that go 10, 12 feet down into our soils. They don't need that. They're growing when we have plenty of moisture, spring and fall. There's no need to be designed that way. So they're not designed that way. When we start to grow mid-May through those hot, dry summer months, the design of these warm season grasses are to have a much larger root system and a much deeper root system. So this is why they can provide 2/3, the 2/3 of your organic matter. They're going to beat these cool season grasses several times over, and that is a huge soil health benefit. These traits, we've kind of talked about these traits just a little bit. I'll leave that there for you to look at for just a minute. Heat stress, humid climates, you know, less susceptible to drought. And I think that we are dealing with weather events that are more extreme. So anything that we can do to mitigate extreme events is what I was talking about by building in resilience and sustainability into our soils. Okay, so you saw this slide before, and we want to just touch on this just briefly again. And so we're seeing that growth curve, and what I want to point out to you is that how tall that middle hump is. That warm season grass spike growth in really right in the month of July. It's really tall. It's a lot taller than the flush of spring grass is in April and 1st of May with cool season grasses. So this means that this is why we only need around that 30%, give or take a few percentages, because we get a lot of grass growth out of these warm season grasses in a short period of time. But one of the things that really makes a difference on the soil health part is when you're not trying to graze these cool season grasses from the back end there of June, July, and August, and the 1st of September. So the soil health benefits that the warm season grasses provide, say on the acres that they are on, that they're planted on, it extends to the rest of the farm because the rest of the farm is getting that rest period that longer rest. You're not having to graze that cool season grass. So we see an extremely large bump in the soil health benefits that rest is giving to that grass. They are able to provide some of that sunshine energy back into the soil because we're not having to focus on grazing on them. So that importance of this curve, I'm hoping you can see my mouse right here. This goes down. If we're not trying to graze on these cool season grasses, they can rest and help these soils out immensely. Typical warm season grass plant, this is that root structure. Now this, you're not seeing any, you're not seeing the mycorrhizal here, okay? This is just the roots. There's a couple things we want to point out, and this slide is greatly used to point out the management where when we use less of the above ground forage, then we have these massive roots that the plants are able to sustain. And that's what we want. We want to be able to sustain these big roots down on the bottom. And I want you to notice that the plants on the right are covered in soil, and that is because they're leaking that sugary exudes and feeding that biology, and that biology is attached to those roots, and this is a very healthy environment over on the right side. That's basically the end of my presentation, and we'll hold the questions till the end. But I would like to say that this is a very brief overview, and I hope that if we strike your interest, you'll tune in to a more a warm season grass shop that we can get more into the details. And thank you.
Great. Thanks, Drexel. Really good stuff there. You definitely triggered a ton of great questions. I will go ahead and send this over to Rick while I get him introduced here. Our next presenter is Rick Rath, a private lands conservationist with the Missouri Department of Conservation. Rick was born and raised in Central Arkansas. He graduated from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock and began his career as a wildlife specialist with the Arkansas Forestry Commission. In 2005, Rick moved to Southwest Missouri to work on the public grasslands and quail focus areas for the Missouri Department of Conservation. Though growing up on the tall pine-covered foothills of the Ozarks, Rick quickly fell in love with the game-rich native grasslands of Southwest Missouri. In 2013, he began his current position as a PLC in Dade, Cedar, and Polk counties. Working in cattle country gives him the opportunity to work with a number of cattlemen to provide grazing systems that add profitability to the farm, as well as quality grassland habitat. And Rick's going to be presenting today on native forages for livestock and wildlife. And I will let Rick take it away. And if you think you have good enough internet, you can turn your webcam on. But I'll let you to it, Rick.
All right. Just sound check real quick, make sure you can hear me good. And
I can hear you, and I can see your screen on my end, Rick.
All right. So yeah, Rick Rath with the Conservation Department. I'm a private lands conservationist, and talking today about the wildlife benefits of this native warm season grass that we've learned about. As a guy that has a few cattle himself, it's always hard to talk about the wildlife benefits without getting roped back into the livestock benefits. And luckily, Landry covered that in detail. So hopefully I'll stay on topic and stick to the wildlife benefits of the native grass. However, you will find throughout my presentation that the same management of the native grass that Landry was describing for the livestock is a lot of times the same management that we are prescribing for the wildlife portion of this. So in short, the proper management, proper grazing of native grass will obviously benefit your livestock, and we take the wildlife benefit of that as a byproduct of proper management. There's really nothing special that you have to do to manage your native grass for quail, as long as you're following proper grazing protocols. So I'm with the Department of Conservation. So you may be asking yourself, why is a state agency that's tasked with protecting the fish force and wildlife of the state, why are we all of a sudden showing up in a lot of these grazing workshops and partnering with NRCS and Extension and MFA in these cooperative positions? And the answer to that is that, over the last several years, we've found that proper grazing provides such a benefit to wildlife, especially grassland wildlife, and a little more specific, grassland obligate bird, the bird group. So we want to be involved. We want to demonstrate proper grazing on our MDC managed areas. But in order to provide a landscaped effect of proper grazing, we really need to work with private landowners. And in many of these areas, our private landowners are cattlemen. So we're deeply involved and really trying to promote the conservation grazing system. Like I mentioned, we use grassland bird species as our target species to demonstrate that the loss of grasslands is a lot, the loss of our grasslands is affecting our wildlife. As you can see, over the last 50 years, we've seen a 50% decline in a number of grassland birds. Other habitat types are also seeing losses, but the grassland bird group really sticks out. So you may say that, well, in my pastures, I see birds like the common, these eastern meadowlarks or western meadowlarks. Yeah, they're still around, but over the last 20 years in some long-term studies, their numbers are going down, and that's an indicator that we're losing their habitat, and what they need is native grasslands. On the other end, we have some species that we've lost almost altogether because of the loss of the native grasslands due to either conversion to a non-native species of grass or the conversion of native grasslands to crop fields. So the grassland bird group we use those because it's a large group and there's a lot of variance within that group. Some of the birds, like thick cover, some like thin, some like litter, some like some shrubby stuff. But a lot of times we can use these birds as indicators of the habitat quality. So if we have a lot of Henslow sparrows, maybe our grasslands becoming a little too thick and we need to increase grazing or increase the frequency of our grazing. If we're seeing a lot more grasshopper sparrows, maybe we're overgrazing a little more than we need to. We need to back off. But the rest of my presentation, a lot of our management as wildlife biologists in Southwest Missouri, at least, is geared towards the northern bobwhite, because they do need a mix of the thick cover and the thin cover, shrubby cover. So we use the quail because it is kind of it's a pretty important species, especially to a lot of the cattlemen that used to quail hunt back in the day, and they love to see the quail return to their farms like they were, back in the 80s. If you've been to any of our MDC workshops and had anything to do with grazing or grass, and you've probably seen this slide, and it's a really good slide. It shows what we have in Missouri, and a lot of what we have in Missouri is fescue pasture. It's grazed pretty short, and there's some species that use it, mainly the cows. But there are some grassland birds that will use it because it creates some habitat for a certain time of the year. On the other end of the scale, we get too thick, and this is where some of our public land or the CRP that we can't graze. It gets too thick. It's basically doesn't provide any better habitat than fescue pasture. We have quite a bit of that in the state as well. So what we really need is that middle ground, the moderate, a little bit of grazing, a little bit of thick cover, a happy medium in there. And that's where we can account for a lot of the species, the grassland bird species needs is in that moderate, that middle ground. So this is what we have in Missouri. A lot of grazed fescue. It doesn't take a trained wildlife biologist to realize that there's not much wildlife benefit to this particular piece of property. That being said, in any cattle operation, you may have some of this, and that's understandable, especially with the droughts we have, the hard winters we have. You're going to have some sacrifice paddocks, but hopefully your whole farm doesn't look like this. Obviously there's no wildlife benefit. I'm not real sure that the cows benefit from this type of management, and definitely the soil doesn't benefit from this type of management, and the longevity of the farm just will not sustain with this type of management. On the right hand of the scale, on the slide we just showed, this is the too thick grass stand. Again, if we're managing for deer and coyotes, this is probably okay, but grass and birds, there's not going to be much use here. It's just too thick. But this is an easy fix. All we have to do to make this basically unusable habitat is add a cow. We add grazing to that situation, all of a sudden we provide structural diversity with the understory that grass and birds can move through. All wildlife are going to benefit. We're adding some plant diversity as well, also gaining, including some really good cattle gains off of this grass. And basically what we're seeing is it's not uniform management. We're getting spotty grazing in certain places, so you'll have some thick cover, some thin cover, and this is more indicative of a patch burn graze system. So we have some tools that provide uniformity. So yes, we do recommend fire as part of the management of native grass. However, we don't want you to burn all of your native grass at one time. If we can go with a 3-year burn rotation, something like that, because burning large scale burns basically remove all the habitat in a very short amount of time. Same way with haying. Basically, you're going to take away all that habitat within a day, and then it's left to hopefully you get some regrowth. So what we're looking for through grazing native grass is basically this picture here, and hopefully this will warm you up a little bit. This is a midsummer picture. There's some grazing taking place, and probably up on the hillside, that was last year's. That probably hasn't been burned in a couple of years. So the grass is getting a little tough. The middle ground, maybe that was burned this year. The cattle are really adhering to that. The grass is fresher, more nutritious, and the area closest to us in the picture, maybe that was last year's burn. They grazed a little heavier than the others. It came back with more of a wildflower response, a little bit of plant diversity, and more structural diversity. However, within this one picture and within this maybe, 20-acre piece of ground, there is a lot of habitat useful to a lot of different wildlife, especially the grass and obligate birds. A close-up picture. So what I see as a wildlife biologist, I see great structural diversity. I see bare ground for the chicks to run, on the ground to get away from the nest, and I see some plant diversity. As a cattleman, I see, and this is a July picture, as a cattleman, I see really nutritious grass that is getting grazed. We're harvesting the grass. We're staying ahead of it. So we're providing really high quality forage, while, again, the byproduct is going to be wildlife benefit of, the grass and habitat. In the picture, you can tell the grass is being grazed. There's some structural diversity. We can't get much better than that. This is just another picture to warm you up on a cold day. Cows grazing in the summertime. This grass may have got a little bit ahead of them. You can see it, some of it's going to seed, but again, really good habitat, really high quality forage. You just can't beat that. So why I mentioned bare ground earlier, and again, we're dealing with quail for the most part. We're managing for quail. So when a quail is hatched, it is the size basically of your thumb. And when it's hatched out of the nest, it's main goal. The hen is going to take those chicks as far away from the nest as possible to get away from the nest. So they need bare ground to move for mobility. But also bare ground is going to create the plant diversity and a little sunshine, and it's going to bring in some insects. And a quail's diet the first several weeks of its life are insects. So we're basically providing a lot of food, a lot of mobility. As long as we got to do, all we have to do is just graze the grass properly and leave some overhead cover. So again, native grass, it's a bunch grass. That bunch grass creates bare ground. The bare ground creates some insects, all the while having overhead cover. With working in the private land division here, we work with a lot of rotational grazing systems, and absolutely great. Rarely do we have landowners that have thousands of acres of prairie and we can, do a patch burn graze system. So we're working in rotational grazing systems, and we can create that same diverse habitat within these rotational systems. Within a rotational system, we're going to have full season grasses. We're going to have 60 to 70% of the farm, maybe even higher, maybe 75 to 80% of the farm is going to be full season grasses. So I don't like to write those acres off as basically no, void of wildlife and no value. Full season grasses can produce good habitat. It just takes a little bit of creativity. Full season grasses are generally solid forming. They're low, dense growth, generally low diversity, as Drexel was talking. Fescue sometimes is not very friendly to other plants, and they don't have that overhead cover like warm season grass does. However, with a little bit of creativity, a little bit of management, you can create decent habitat within cool season grasses. And when you have warm season grasses included in your grazing system, you can have the rest that these cool seasons need. So burning cool season grasses, that adds a little bit of diversity to the pasture. Rotational grazing, including rest periods for the grasses. And then, a roll of polywire and some step-in posts, you can do amazing things for wildlife just by moving cows throughout the pastures, creating rest periods, creating some bare ground. So I mentioned earlier we really got into the grazing. The NDC really got into grazing, and part of it was a quail study that we did here in Southwest Missouri. It was basically a 5-year study. We radio marked quail in February, followed them all the way through November. Basically, we were wanting to see where was their successful nest, where were we having successful nest? Grazed areas. 33% of nest success was in, if they nested in an ungrazed area, they had 33% nest success. And that's pretty typical of most quail studies. However, in grazed areas, we were finding they were having 65% nest success. That's double our nest success of ungrazed areas. That is very significant. That's a significant increase. Also, we found that 90% of all brood locations were in grazed areas. So the red outline on this slide is an MDC area that one of the prairies is 960 acres. Basically, if we add the neighbors to it, it's 1,280 acres. Each dot is a quail location on a different day. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see what area was not grazed that particular year. This was ungrazed area, and there is very little quail use. All the other areas we have a rotational or actually patch burn graze system. The quail definitely prefer a grazed system. This portion over here was unburned and ungrazed. Obviously, they went in there every once in a while, but they definitely liked the grazed portions. Even on the neighbors where maybe it's not warm season grass, but it's a cool season grass that they manage a little different. They're using those areas because there's some plant diversity and some bare ground. So not every situation we can use patch burn grazing, very limited actually. So like I said, we work a lot with rotational systems, and rotational systems are great. We can provide that habitat. However, a lot of times our stocking rate is a little bit higher, so we do need to consider protected nesting habitat basically. So if 25 to 30% of your total pasture acres are native warm season grass, and we're using those higher stock densities, we could lose 20% of nest due to trampling if we are at the one cow per acre stocking rate. 20% nest loss is tolerable, being that you're creating some excellent brood habitat, and brood habitat is what is our really limiting factor. When we get up to that 5 cows per acre, we're at 100% nest loss. That we can't do that. So if we are stocking at that rate, we do need to incorporate some of these protected nesting paddocks. Basically, don't graze those until after July 15th. Let the chicks get out of the nest and away, and then you can turn in and graze those. So throughout these whole presentations, hopefully now you want some native grass on your place. And one of the things we hear a lot is, well, native, it's so expensive to establish this native grass, and it is. It's fairly costly, but there are several funding sources out there, and I just want to touch real quick. The USDA, NRCS, who Drexel Atkinson works for, they have cost share available. The Soil and Water Conservation District, often located in the same office as NRCS in your county, they have funding available. Department of Conservation has funding available through cost share programs. So there is help. There's plenty of technical help. There's plenty of financial help. You just need to contact one of the resource professionals to help you out. First step, go to MDC, our MDC homepage. Right there in the corner, you can choose your county. Let's see. Choose your county, pops up your private land conservations. Give them a shout. They will be able to help you out and direct you on which cost share program will best suit your needs. You can also visit the USDA service centers located in each county. There will be Soil and Water Conservation District folks there, as well as NRCS, and they can, again, direct you to where you need to be. So, take home points I just want to stick on here is the birds in greatest need don't nest in trees. We're talking about the grassland, the ground nesting birds, the quail birds, grassland obligate birds are the ones that are in trouble. And native foragers can help these birds while increasing grain capacity on your farm and boosting your bottom line. That is my contact information if you'd like to contact me. Hopefully I left some time for questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rick. Appreciate that. We've got just a few minutes. Before we get into questions, I am going to retake this, and hopefully the right screen is going to show up. Yes. Okay. Just to tag on to what Rick was talking about there, and presenters, if you guys would go ahead and unmute yourselves and turn your webcams back on, we'll ask you questions here in just a second. Here is a contact slide, the top one, the Missouri Department of Conservation. If you click that link, that will take you to that professionals finder that Rick had showed there. There's an NRCS office locator right there. And also, if you click the MFA link, that will take you to get contact info for myself or Landry. This is the same exact document with those links. It's also in the handouts on the side of your screen. You should be able to click the little handouts box and download a PDF. And so that way you actually have those links and should be able to just click them, and it should take you straight there. We are recording this session and plan to get that recording out to everyone as soon as we possibly can. So stay tuned for that. We'll send an email with a link. You will also be getting an email about an hour after this presentation, and inside that email will be a survey that we hope that you take the time to fill out. We really appreciate if you would take the time to do so. We promised we'd get you out of here in an hour, and we have. Please stick out for the question and answer session. We'll hold these guys on here as long as it takes to get through most of these questions as we go. But I wanted to get that out of there in case some folks had to jump off of here. So, all right, gentlemen, I've got a ton of questions, so try to make your answers brief here. I'll try to throw it to one person individually so we can kind of crank through most of these questions and get everybody an answer. So Drexel, I'll shoot you with this one. How well do warm season grasses do in different parts of the state? This producer looks like is in eastern Missouri, so Jefferson County in the St. Louis area.
So they do well. They do, those grasses do well. I don't think there's even though the map that Landry had put up about where those native grasses originated or where they were originally, I don't think we can exclude any part of Missouri from growing the native grasses quite well. So it is important, I think, we to get as seed that's harvested as locally as possible, and so that you get plants that are used to growing in as near an environment as you are. But I wouldn't exclude anywhere in Missouri for the native grasses.
Okay, great. Got another question here on is it good, bad, or indifferent to plant something like this over a septic field? In my mind, I would worry a little bit about the root system of these things, but Drexel, you want to tackle that one too?
I don't know that I'm going to provide a great answer there, other than we have seen some of the deep rooting plants get into drainage tiles and whatnot, so I wouldn't think that the septic system would be any different. I really don't want to say yay or nay, but it would make sense that they're going to root deeper.
Yeah, that'd be my thought on that one too. How about horses on warm season grass? One of you guys want to tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, they are. It's beneficial. There's really not much harm to most of the species. So, you know, I wouldn't see an issue with it. The biggest thing is, you know, if you're from a diversity standpoint, you know, probably still in that, you know, 25 to 30% of the acres in it. You know, it's only going to provide forage for certain months of the year. So keep in mind that you need some other sort of cool season, probably forage on the front and back end of the season, spring and fall. But yeah, not much issue that I see in most of those species.
Okay.
Touch on that one really quickly, if I could, Adam.
Yeah.
Horses and grazing systems are a unique combination, because horses, we have to watch horses for grass bounders. So the management of the grasses with the keeping them where they need to be vegetative and not overgrazing tends to put horses on a better forage system than they need constantly. So being able to turn them out and let them graze these grasses and then bring them back in for a few hours a day is better management for the grass and the horse oftentimes. So just keep that in mind, that constant grazing can provide too good a forage oftentimes to horses.
Okay. Yeah. Appreciate that point there. Rick, I'll throw this one at you. What about a native cool season grass? And how would that incorporate into a grazing system?
Yeah, so there's several native cool season grasses, and part of the reason you don't see them on our native prairies much anymore is because back in the day when you know, the buffalo were roaming around, these native cool season grasses are so nutritious, so palatable that they overgrazed them out. So when you talk about native cool seasons, you want to talk about the like the Virginia wild rye, Canadian wild rye, grasses like that. Absolutely can fit into a grazing system. It will. You just have to manage them a little different than you would your typical, you know, fescue or orchard grass cool season pastures. Definitely, but definitely would be beneficial, and I'd be happy to answer more questions or work, you know, individually on that one.
Sure. Cool. Good answer. Drexel, I'll throw this one at you too, because you mentioned a little bit on the fertilizer stuff for warm season grass. Similar requirements to get 2 cuttings, or thoughts on getting 2 cuttings of warm season grass and maybe a fertilizer component to that?
So fertilization on warm season grasses, we look at you really could almost just cut the fertilizer requirements or the removal rates of phosphorus and potash to a third of what cool season grasses removed per ton. So much more efficient. As far as nitrogen goes, we look to really 50 pounds of nitrogen being the top end of nitrogen fertilization for the native grasses. And a second cutting, okay, but not every year. So we really start to look at when that second cutting comes off and how much regrowth we're going to get after that cutting. So, you know, occasionally, but we really need the haying of any forage removes a lot of its solar panel. We take it all away. So we don't have time to discuss all of the things about haying, but be cautious about the second cutting routinely.
Okay, yep, good answer there. Another question about grazing this grass in the winter. I'm assuming as a stockpiling scenario there, one of you guys want to tackle kind of how that could possibly work or not work?
Yeah, so, you know, from a nutritional standpoint, there's not going to be much value there to these native forages in the wintertime. Where I've seen them from a stockpiling standpoint be beneficial is if you're in a scenario where maybe you're stockpiling fescue or you've got some green lush vegetation in fall and winter months, and these native grasses provide some filler that them cattle are going to need to help with that rumen digestion. And so that's where I've seen these be good in a stockpiling scenario, and just by themselves, is kind of just to help supplement some other forages that the cattle may be on.
Okay, good. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Question about cost sharing, and I think Rick covered that just a little bit, and so we'll skip over that one. And if you need more assistance on that, jump on that MDC link or the NRCS offices, or get a hold of Landry, and we'll get you set up there. Okay, here's a good question. Can you mix cool season grass and native warm season grasses in pastures, or more beneficial to have them separate?
So I'll kind of take that one. They can be put together, but from a longevity standpoint of both species, really, they probably need to be split into separate paddocks because of those growth curves and the times that they are providing the most nutrition. Those are two different times, and so by putting them in the same field, it kind of goes back to what Rick said of why we don't see a lot of our native cool season grasses still in our native prairies, is because they're going to selectively choose one or the other and overgraze one and not graze the other. So by putting them in separate paddocks, we as producers can physically manage when those cattle consume that forage.
Okay, that's good. And so the next one here I've got is there's a couple questions that are kind of geared towards this, and I'll let you, Landry, or Rick probably take this one on. What would you guys recommend any forbs in some of these warm season grass plantings? And if so, kind of what direction would you recommend somebody going in that scenario?
I'll take that, Landry. So we do recommend forbs. However, it's usually not the first planting that will do that. That means we got to get control of competition in a newly seeded native planting. When you throw in forbs, you're really tying your hands on herbicides. So we use a lot of imazapic for, especially in the cattle production system, we need grass there fast. And the best way to do that, and this is a whole nother presentation probably on establishment, but the fastest way to get grass is to use imazapic to control that competition. So if you throw in a lot of forbs, although there are some imazapic tolerant forbs, we really want to focus on getting that grass established first. If you want to include some forbs and wildflowers, by all means, go for it. There are forbs that are highly beneficial to cattle grazing, and again, they add a lot of diversity to the soil as well. But first things first, let's get the grass established. Let's get the forage there, and also we're getting that structural diversity that we didn't have before, when it was a fescue field or a crop field. So by getting just the grass established, we're winning already. Once the grass is established, if we want to up our game and throw in some forage, by all means, we can do that.
Okay, and that kind of leads into actually another question I have on here a couple times, Rick, about interseeding, either interseeding extra warm season grass, and you just mentioned interseeding forbs. Can that work on paddocks?
It absolutely can. You just got to keep in mind when you're running, when you're moving your cattle through there, that you will have some seedling plants, and you want to protect those first year seedling plants because they don't have the root structure to withstand the grazing. That cattle will actually pull the entire plant out of the ground instead of just taking the bites. So if you do have seedling plants, if you overseed and you have seedling plants in a paddock, you need to really concentrate on taking the top half of the established plants, and hopefully that's protecting those smaller plants.
Okay, thanks for that. Any concerns with wintering cows and feeding cool season hay on a warm season grass pasture in hilly terrain? You guys had mentioned stuff about bare ground. Are you worried about erosion there or problems with seed from some of that hay to kind of get into that warm season grass planting? Drexel, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I can. So yes, we would be concerned with feeding hay of unknown origin or known origin that would have seed in it of grasses that would become a problem. So yes, we would want to be concerned about our hay feeding in those warm season grass areas. As far as the erosion, once those grasses are established, they have a very good root system, and we should not experience a lot of, we shouldn't have an erosion problem once that stand is established. That would not be a concern.
Okay. Got a question here about using the herbicides, panoramic or plateau with success to control invasive cool season grasses. I think we touched on that, but I don't know, Landry, you want to hit that again real quick?
Yep. So yes, that imazapic herbicide, panoramic or plateau, whichever brand name you purchase, from controlling cool season grasses alone, just with that herbicide, it can be done at the higher labeled rate. To me, if you're looking, if you've got an established stand of warm season grass and you've got some cool season grasses coming in, to use some timely sprayings of just glyphosate before, either in the spring before that native grass starts to grow, or in the fall after it's gone dormant, you can spray glyphosate over the top of those dormant warm season grass plants to kill any fescue or cool season grass or weeds that may be in that. So I guess I wouldn't use that panoramic or that imazapic herbicide for controlling cool season grasses. There's some other cheaper ways to do it.
Okay. Another one down that same line here, Landry. Got someone who planted some warm season grass January of last year, mowed it a couple times last year, but pretty weedy and doesn't think it looked like much. What about using some sort of herbicide on there this spring?
Yep. So a lot of times these warm season grasses can take a couple years to really show themselves. Very rarely do we really get to see the benefits of that first year planting in that first year. So I guess I would first kind of throw out some caution and be patient. They're probably there. They're just going to take some time to express themselves. But if you feel like weeds are an issue and those weeds are potentially out competing those warm season grasses, there's a couple things. The imazapic herbicide on big blue stem, little blue stem, and Indian grass can be used to spray over the top of those growing warm season grasses to help with some weed competitions. It's mainly used more from a pre-emergent standpoint to keep those grasses from germinating and from sprouting. A lot of times once those native warm season grasses get to the 3 to 4 leaf stage in a seedling standpoint, then we can use most broadleaf herbicides that are out there. So I would recommend reading the label on those broadleaf herbicides to double check, but for the most part, that's kind of the go-to.
Okay, good. And I've got a couple of questions here, one of which I think we've already kind of been through, talking about segregating cool season grasses and warm season grasses. But another question on the end of this about legumes and warm season grass, and I had another one on planting clover with warm season grasses. One of you guys want to talk a little bit about that?
I can take that if you want.
Okay. Yep.
So the legumes that we typically associate with the warm season grass would be the Lespedeza, the common, the Korean, those type of Lespedezas. Want to be cautious about incorporating the cool season legumes. They're you know, the growth curves again aren't gonna align very well. So keeping in the warm season legumes that we would think of, and then back to the forb discussion that Rick had. So yes, after they're well established, we can incorporate Lespedeza is pretty common.
Okay. What about you guys mentioned the price a little bit. What's kind of a generalized price per acre that I can expect on seeding, like reseeding a cool season grass pasture to warm season grass? And we mentioned there's some cost share available there, but I think somebody just looking for maybe seed or herbicide cost numbers.
Okay, I'll take that. For seed, you're looking at about let's say $140 to $150 per acre just for the seed. The herbicide figure, if you're going to have somebody spray it, figure about $20 to $25 an acre. So we also recommend, if this is a livestock production field, we recommend getting your soil test and getting your lime and fertilizer applied according to soil test. So add another $80 for each of those. We're up to about $250, $280 by the time you have fertilizer, lime, a couple sprays, and enough seed.
Okay. What about holding stock off of established or establishing plantings? When you guys want to talk a little bit about kind of how long we need to hold stock off of there, and kind of what the boundaries of that are?
Yeah, so most of the time that first year, if we're establishing these natives in either a dormant season broadcast or we're drilling them in early spring, that first year of growth for those forages, we're not going to utilize really at all. We're going to dedicate that whole first growing season to the grasses themselves to allow them to, the reason that these grasses are so productive is that their root systems are so deep, and that's essentially kind of what they're doing the first year is they're growing down before they grow up. So we got to allow them to do that for longevity of the stand. Typically, depending on the successfulness of the planting, that second year can be grazed lightly. It kind of depends on a case-by-case basis, but most times, that second year you can look at getting some light grazing out of it, and then the third year you can implement it back into your full rotation and graze it, like it's supposed to be.
Okay. Talking about sloping ground. I think we covered that. Warm season grasses have a great root system and definitely can actually help on as far as being planted on sloping ground. One of you guys want to touch a little bit on hay cutting, as far as cutting height, and also when it was going to be the best time to cut hay off of warm season grass?
So
I might
go ahead.
Well, I was just I'll take that one, I guess, and maybe throw a little bit of soil health in there. So the cutting height, we're looking at the same type of cutting recommendations or timing is looking at that boot stage to boot to just late boot. But then the cutting height, we want to elevate on these warm season grasses to minimum 6 and 8. 8 is even better. But we are cutting these, and that is another reason we're cutting these probably in the first part of July. That's where that's going to land oftentimes. So it's pretty warm, and we got to consider that the biology on the soil surface, and so keeping that cutting height up higher also keeps that soil surface cooler. That keeps us from drying out and also keeps the biological activity in the surface of the soil active. So there's a lot of reasons to bring that cutting height up, but from the physiology part of the plant, we need to be up there in that 6 to 8 inch range.
Okay, good. Thanks for that, Drexel. Another question here about native cool season grasses and forbs. We talked a little bit about that. What about some folks from kind of South Central or Southern Missouri? We're talking about, will native warm season grasses do well here since it's not considered a prairie? Here is in forested areas of Missouri. And so one of you kind of maybe hit on that. And also, would a warm season such as Bermuda do better?
So yeah, I mean, like Drexel mentioned, our native warm season grasses can be established about anywhere in the state. Now, with that being said, there might be some species out there that are more adapted to your local soils, depending on, you know, the depth of soil, things like that. So it's not a one size fits all, but most of our native forages, grasses can be planted about anywhere in the state. I would say if you're questioning whether native grasses will grow on your site, maybe due to the lack of soil or rocky soil, I wouldn't recommend Bermuda. Bermuda usually likes a little better soil, going to require a little bit more nutrient input. So I guess from that scenario, I probably wouldn't recommend Bermuda if you're questioning whether native warm season grasses will work, because native grasses will work on thinner soils.
Yep. Ditto on what Landry said there for sure. We talked a little bit about hay cutting heights. Okay, one of you guys want to talk a little bit about burning warm season grasses or burning frequency?
Yeah, I can once I get the kids in. We usually try to burn in the springtime, and that's for a couple of different reasons. The first one is usually about, you know, the end of April is a good time because that's when the burning actually promotes the grass growth. As far as wildlife goes, you know, you can spring burns. We don't want a field, if you burn it in the wintertime, basically you're going to have a black field going through the winter, and that's when we need that warm season grass for cover. So basically you're taking away a lot of usable space throughout those winter months. So we spring burns for that very reason, because of the grass growth and the wildlife net.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Rick. Appreciate it. What about species or how these would work on a poorly drained soil, or with helping with soil erosion along a river?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to that earlier question that was mentioned. You know, it kind of gets species dependent. You know, if you've got some odd areas that either stay real wet or stay real dry, it's going to kind of be more dependent on the individual species. You know, in this scenario with a real wet soil or maybe along a river bottom, that's probably where I would maybe suggest a switchgrass. Some of these grasses, some of the native warm season grasses do better in drier conditions and drier sites. So in that scenario, I would probably lean more towards a switchgrass variety of some sort in those wetter soils.
Yep, no, that's a good answer. And then as far as working on soil erosion, again, with the deeper root system, they're definitely going to be better than any other herbaceous vegetation that could be planted, if you're talking about some sort of riparian corridor type area. Got a question here on seeding rate. I think that's going to depend on which species that you're going with, if you're doing a monoculture, if you're doing a mix. So there's kind of a lot of variability there. I'd just look for somebody to kind of look at your site and what you want to plant as far as that goes. And then let's see, we talked about hay. So we've already answered some of these questions, which is great. Talking about, again, here's a question for Rick. What about with quail hatch success? You discussed grazed and non-grazed. What about hayed warm season grass compared to grazed warm season grass?
So I actually was involved with some of the pilot study on this, the pilot work on this study, and we rarely found, well, I'll say we never found a quail nest on a hay prairie. The reason being, I think the quail realize that every time they have a nest there and it's about to hatch, about the first time, 1st of July, they're getting ready to hatch that nest and get the chicks away. The hay vine comes up over them and destroys the nest and the eggs. So they just gave up on that. Also, hay prairies are generally pretty grass dominant, not much plant diversity. So you get less bare ground and less insects because of the grass dominated stand. So obviously the grazing is going to be a lot better for quail because you're going to get some of the bare ground, you're going to get that plant diversity, structural diversity, and it's slowly being harvested rather than all gone in one day.
Yeah, absolutely. And hay is just kind of one of those necessary evils out there that exist in agriculture.
Yeah, and we haying is a management practice, and if you could rotate that, maybe on a 3-year where you're haying a field every 3rd year, and you can move that around the farm, that would be a great kind of mitigation in order to still get some hay off the farm, but provide a little bit of cover for wildlife.
Yep. Okay, I think this may be one of our last questions. Jason's really opening a can of worms with this one, so I'll kick it to Drexel. Since buying a farm in Northeast Missouri, I've been attempting to bring soils back to life after being overgrazed. My focus is on deer, but would love to see other habitat for pheasants or quail. What can I do for soil health improvements? Person says they are doing some prescribed burns.
Well, there's a lot of things that we can do, and if that is a can of worms, but we would start maybe by looking what's growing there now. If it came from a perennial crop or annual crop, we would look at maybe some cover crops, some multi-species annuals to really pump some sunshine into those soils, to really get that biology cranking again and get soil back alive. And then obviously moving in part of those acres into a native grass mixture would ultimately be a great soil health process. There's a lot of site specifics that are hard to get into, but there's definitely good, we have some good recipes to improve soil health in our forage systems.
Yeah, I'd absolutely say that. That's definitely a site-specific thing. I just encourage you to jump on there and get a hold of one of us and get somebody out there, and we can certainly steer you in the right direction. Just a reminder here that there are I would concur that there are some great native seed companies in Missouri, usually good resources for establishing some of these grasses as well. Grow Native website, some of those like that would have some of those vendors listed on there. Here's another question. Woody cover can be a limiting factor for bobwhite populations, but woody encroachment can also lead to lost forage. What are some strategies you've used to accommodate this need without negatively impacting the cattle producer?
Yeah, so in Southwest Missouri, woody cover is not an issue. We have plenty. You leave a field idle for a year or two and you have more woody cover than you ever wanted. So the way we control that is through burns. We can set back woody succession with prescribed fire. We can also do that with select herbicide applications during certain stages of that growth. If a limiting factor, maybe if you're in North Missouri and you don't have enough shrubby cover, planting covey headquarters in odd areas that can be protected from grazing, maybe polywire, something like that would be an option. Down tree structures, if you have a fence row, has a few cedars in it, go ahead and knock those cedars down. You can drag those in the middle of the field or along the edges. But woody cover, it is important in the quail, biology. However, generally it's not our limiting factor. Generally, it's the brood rearing cover that we're accomplishing through managed grazing.
Yep, that's a good answer, Rick. I believe, and I really hesitate to say this, but I think we have answered all the questions. Guys, you really punch some buttons because I was having a hard time keeping up with everything here on this end with the questions. Appreciate everybody sending those in. Hopefully we got yours answered. If we did not get it answered to your satisfaction, shoot one of us an email, and happy to continue that conversation. Thanks everybody for being on here. Sorry we went so long, and just wanted to make sure we got everybody an answer that was still on here, kind of waiting for an answer to their question. Definitely appreciate you joining today. Again, please fill out that survey, and we are recording this, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.